Welcome back to episode 4 of the Project Finance Infrastructure Modeling series. And today we're going to look at a little bit of a case study, a very simple hydro project that we're going to start to build our construction and cash flow and debt structure based on. So let's jump right into it. So first we have our legacy debt tab that was essentially a single input for CFADS. And we're going to go in and repurpose this. But the first thing we need to do is mirror up our timelines. So we have a January 1, 2021 start date, and that's when construction's going to start. That's also where every single time series is going to start. And I like to keep it consistent throughout as you're never having weird lookups or anything like that. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to go in and insert a bunch of rows. So given our 15-year PPA period, we're going to give us a decent amount of tail, and we're going to go out to 2061 just to ensure that we have sufficient runway to do everything we possibly want with this model. And that's probably more than we'll need, but I'm essentially just going to insert a bunch of rows and then pull everything across. And that should, as long as you start here and pull everything across so your discount factors come. Okay, so once we have this tab, we're just going to duplicate these tabs and we're going to call it cash flow. We're going to color code the tabs slightly. So all of our debt is going to be green and our cash flows is going to be blue. And then we're going to have an input sheet going to be this yellow, similar to our inputs. On our cash flow tab, we're essentially going to remove all of this as it's no longer relevant. Bye-bye MOA. And we're going to start with a couple sections. So we have production, revenue, Opex, free cash flows. All this is going to eventually be is our revenue less our Opex equals free cash flow. Okay, so I've grabbed a bunch of the key details from the case study, starting with capacity, and just zoom in here a little bit so you can see everything. So we have 1,200 megawatts per the case study. We have 24 hours in a day, so capacity per day. I pulled in our production factor, degradation factor, our escalation assumptions from our PPA, which you can find down here, 2% and 1% per annum. We have our PPA price and merchant price. Those are held flat. Merchant would definitely not for the case study. And we have our production split, our merchant split. And then we go down into Opex. So we have 400K per annum, escalates at 5%. And the employee cost will escalate 5% per annum as well. And because we're working with a quarterly model, I've dropped those down into quarterly, making adjustments to the per annum. And we have our construction initial details down here. Okay, so now we have enough to go in and start building out our production section. We're going to try and make things as clean and as broken out as possible to ensure the model is very easy to audit and very easy to manipulate. So the first thing we're going to do is grab our degradation factor, go in and index that. So we're going to grab this, and we're actually just going to steal the formula that we previously used for inflation. We're going to pull in our degradation factor from our input sheet, Alt ESL. Then we're going to start building out our actual operations. So we're going to first need to break this out. Days in the period is just going to be our closing date minus our opening date plus 1 to count the actual day of occurrence. You'll know you did this correctly if you summed up to 365. We need to, before we go anywhere, we need to change this to January 1, 2021 in both tabs. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is grab our operating period. So we have January 1, 2021 construction start date, a 60-month timeline, and we get to start our operations Jan 1, 2026. This formula was already used before, so that's really simple. So our operating period, format this a little bit differently. We're going to go in and take additional formatting to go and clearly show when we're in an operating period and when we're not. So we're just starting with a simple format of, a light green, dark green text. Bold. All we're going to do is say, you'll do that formula when this not locked equals 1. Okay. And you'll see that. And then we're going to go back into this, duplicate this rule, essentially just flip it. So this is going to equal 0. And we're actually not going to have any number format here. We're just going to basically gray this out. We're going to take this, and that's all we're going to do. And what that cleanly shows us is a simple marker where, okay, we're not in an operating period here. We're going to just remove the rest of these because They're legacy and relevant to the other tab. But what we are going to keep is our inflation period. So our inflation period is simply going to be the sum product of our frac, as that's just going to basically count the number of quarters that have occurred since we started operating. So it's 0.25. Now we're at 1 year, 1.25, and so on. Very simple. Then we're going to take our degradation factor, which is just going to be 1 up until your first, and then you're going to do a simple inflation year formula. Okay, so once we've figured out our inflation period, we're just going to use our similar floor function that we used and look back a period. So what this is going to do is there will be no inflation in our first year, and then starting in our second year we'll have inflation, but it's annual inflation. We don't want to be inflating every quarter, so the floor function is very helpful. Go and implement that. Then we're just simply going to move our degradation factor to reference our inflation year, and next we're going to start building out our actual production now. So we start very basic with our capacity, and that's going to be our megawatts per day, and we're just going to go in, link our input, there's our capacity, and we're going to just times our capacity times our operating period. So we link our capacity, and our capacity is going to just times by the days in the quarter, and that's going to give us our megawatts per quarter. Okay. Next, we're going to have our production factor, our degradation, and our net production. So we're going to take our production factor, which is how much of our capacity we can actually produce. And very often you'll have underwriting capacity factors depending on the asset that will be signed on by the independent engineer. And this independent engineer will basically go in and provide you an underwriting case that will factor in different P curves and production that ensures the debt that you're underwriting can actually be achieved. The production levels that an IE will sign off on will be verified by a bunch of different inputs, including technology, historical operations, different water flows for hydro, what your maintenance and uptime of your asset will be. So there's all kinds of things that will be going into this production factor. So all we're going to do is take our capacity and times it by our production factor. And then we're going to pull in our degradation, and our degradation is going to be simply a multiplication times our production times the degradation factor, which will basically represent the asset deteriorating over time. So we're going to times it by factor times the degradation factor times the actual production, and we're going to put a negative in front of all of this. So that's basically what your production is going to lose over time. And then our net production is just going to be the sum of these. So, and then now we have our actual production of our asset. Now we're going to start to build down to our revenue. So our revenue is just going to be comprised of our pricing times our escalation times our associated production times our total revenue. So this is going to be US dollars per kilowatt, and we're going to pull in our inputs, and we're simply just going to times this by our operating period. And then we're going to have an escalation row, and we're going to copy our same logic before. We have PPA and merchant. We're going to link these in, simply pull them across, and you'll see slightly different inflations because of the different factors. Then we're going to pull in our associated production, our megawatt, and our split here. So we're going to take our net production and times it by our associated production. Lock that in, pull it across. And lastly, we're actually going to get down to total revenue finally. And our total revenue is simply going to be escalation times our pricing times our production, 1,000. So we're just going to simply divide this by 3, 10 to the power of 3. And total revenue is just simply going to be a sum of the two numbers above. Now we have Opex. We're going to start with our escalation with Opex, and let's do that throughout. Make the model a little cleaner. We always have escalation. Let's just call this escalation and then production here. Cleaner you can make things, simpler it's going to be. At some point in your career, you may have to, depending on where you're located and depending on the transactions you work on, you may have to undergo model audits from independent parties. And the cleaner you make your work, the quicker you can get a clean audit opinion, as some lenders require outright in order to proceed with the transaction. So it's always easier to have really, really clear logic and formatting throughout, make everyone else's lives easier who are looking at your model. We pulled in escalation, and then we're simply going to just pull in our Opex costs, which are pretty simple here. I should probably stop using the word simple, but that is the idea here, is to make things painless and abundantly clear. Pull in O&M costs and our employee cost, and then total Opex cost. And then this is just simply going to be your input times your escalation factor times your operating period. And we're going to put some sums here. So now we have our total Opex cost, and we're simply just going to link all this up. So we aren't using this inflation index anymore. We're going to link our revenue to our total revenue line, our Opex to our total Opex line, and then we'll sum that. We have the beginnings of a very simple cash flow model that goes in and essentially gives us the beginning working of something we can start to build a debt structure around and eventually build in recontracting assumptions, incremental debt. Opex needs to be negative. Now we have our proper cash flows. And then we just want to split our cash flows. So this is free cash flow / CFADS. And then we're going to want to show our contracted CFADS and our merchant CFADS. And that will have debt sizing implications in most markets as they have fundamentally different risk parameters. Your contracted CFADS should have a much more limited risk profile than your merchant CFADS, as your contracted CFADS should be essentially only exposed to a couple risks: your off-taker paying and paying on time, any basis, and any curtailment risk with transmission lines. If you're talking about power purchased agreements, a contracted cash flow would have a much more lenient debt sizing requirement than a merchant cash flow is. Merchant has all the same risk parameters as contracted cash flows, but your price is unknown and technically could be negative. So there could be no availability of the merchant CFADS that you've modeled. So we'll get into that when we revisit our debt structure. But I wanted to very clearly outline that merchant and contracted CFADS are fundamentally different. But one more line in here, and clearly contracted portion, how we're getting to our contracted, and then we're going to say merchant portion. A lot of people will do all of this in one single formula, and I will advise you to limit doing that. The more you do in a formula, the more that can go wrong, versus having each step broken out as cleanly as possible. We have our escalation, our pricing, our associated production to get to revenue. It may seem tedious in the time, but will save you hundreds of hours throughout your career, as you will have clean, audible modeling throughout. So we're just going to go in and calculate our contracted portion, and our merchant portion is just going to be 1 minus that number, or we can simply pull that formula down and they'll both get you to 100%. So we're going to pull the formula down just for consistency. And then our contracted CFADS is just going to simply be our free cash flow times our contracted portion. That will be the exact same formula for merchant as well. Free cash flow CFADS times our contracted portion gets us to our contracted CFADS, and vice versa for merchant CFADS. A clear split of our CFADS so we can go in and apply the different debt sizing parameters as stipulated in our term sheet. So we're just going to put a quick couple of sums here. All I'm going to check is the sum of these two equals our total free cash flows. If you enjoyed the content, please like and please subscribe. I'll be trying to upload at least twice a week. The hope of uploading 3 times a week, and I will catch you in the next video.